Hi friends, welcome to UPSC World. This is Dr. Harinath Reddy. The prelims result is expected very soon, probably tomorrow. So for all those who are preparing for the UPSC mains exam, this topic is again very important. We all know that Wakf Amendment Act 2025, it was under challenge before the Indian Supreme Court. So this is the context in which this amendment may become important for your upcoming mains exam. So what is this amendment all about? What is good in amendment? What is bad in amendment? We will try to discuss. Before that, what is Wakf? What is the history of Wakf legislation in this country? Then, what are the different reforms which were planned under the recent Amendment Act 2025? What is good? What is bad? We will try to discuss in this video. So let's get started and let's first define what is Wakf. So in Islam, Wakf refers to movable or immovable property which is permanently dedicated for religious or charitable purposes. It is permanently dedicated, which means it cannot be taken back. It cannot be sold. So if you take the history of Wakf, it goes back to 1200 AD. So Wakf is a movable or immovable property permanently dedicated for religious or charitable purposes under Islam. That's the definition of Wakf. Then, as of now, as the Wakf Amendment Act 2025 was under challenge, the existing Wakf administration is carried on under the Wakf Act of 1995. We had several legislations starting from 1813, 1913. So even before we discuss the history of Wakf legislation, the existing law which forms the basis for Wakf administration in this country is Wakf Act of 1995. So this Wakf Act of 1995 has created the following bodies. One is Central Wakf Council. We have at the state level State Wakf Board, and then we have Wakf Tribunal. If you take the Central Wakf Council, it advises the government and the state Wakf boards on policy, but does not directly control Wakf properties. It does not directly control the properties of Wakf, but it gives advice, policy advice to the government and also the state Wakf boards. That's the function of Central Wakf Council. Then if you take the state Wakf boards, they manage and protect the Wakf properties in each state. And then if there is any dispute with respect to the Wakf property, the matter is decided in the Wakf Tribunal. It was an exclusive judicial body that handles disputes related to Wakf properties. As I said earlier, the first legislation in this country to regulate Wakf properties, it was made in 1913. The Mussalman Wakf Validating Act 1913. So it allowed Muslims to create Wakfs for family benefit, eventually leading to charitable purposes. This is the first legislation. Later on, there was one more legislation which was made in 1923, the Mussalman Wakf Act 1923. So it introduced rules for proper accounting and transparency in Wakf management. Later on in 1930, there was one more legislation, the Mussalman Wakf Validating Act 1930. It strengthened the legal validity of family Wakfs, giving legal backing to the 1913 Act. Then, after independence, this is all before independence. After independence, the first legislation which was enacted to regulate Wakf properties in this country is Wakf Act 1954. It is under this law, the Central Wakf Council was created, state Wakf boards were created. So the Wakf Act 1954 created state Wakf boards for the first time to oversee Wakf properties. It also established the Central Wakf Council in 1964 to supervise state Wakf boards. Later on, in 1995, another legislation was made to regulate Wakf properties. And the 1995 Act has repealed the earlier law. The 1954 law was repealed and a new law was enacted to regulate Wakf in this country, that is called the Wakf Act 1995. So this comprehensive act repealed the 1954 Act and all its amendments. This was enacted to govern the administration of Wakf properties in India. And this 1995 Act also created a Wakf tribunals. Tribunals are special courts with powers similar to civil courts. Tribunal decisions are final and cannot be challenged in civil courts. And see the property of Wakf property in India to get an imagination of what is the extent of Wakf property in this country. As per the central government website called WAMSI, there are 32 Wakf boards in this country. They reported 8.72 lakh properties covering an area of more than 38 lakh acres. The total Wakf property in this country, it amounts to 38 lakh acres. Out of these, 8.72 lakh properties, 4.02 lakhs are Wakf by user. Then, so here if you see from 1913 to 2024, we have seen a series of legislations regulating the Wakf properties in this country. Then there was an amendment done in 2013 to the 1995 legislation, that is Wakf Amendment Act 2013. So this created 3-member Wakf tribunal including a Muslim law expert. So if you take the amendments which were done in 2013, it has changed the composition of the Wakf tribunal. Wakf tribunal will contain 3 members. One of them is a Muslim law expert. It also required 2 women members. Representation given to Muslim women in the state Wakf boards. It's compulsory. It also increased the lease period of Wakf properties from 3 years to 30 years for better use of the Wakf property. So the lease period was increased from 3 years to 30 years so that if the Wakf property is given on lease, better revenue can be generated if the lease term is very long. Then let's take up the Wakf Amendment Bill 2025. So what are the important reforms which were attempted in this 2025 Amendment Bill? So the first reform is, so we are discussing what are the important reforms which were brought in through Wakf Amendment Act 2025. The first one is a centralized portal will automate Wakf property management including registration, audits, contributions and litigation, ensuring efficiency and transparency. So the first reform which was suggested is automation using technology for better administration of Wakf properties by increasing transparency. The second one, the Amendment Act of 2025 says only a Muslim is eligible to give Wakf. So non-Muslims are not allowed to give Wakf, that is movable or removable property for the religious and charitable purposes of Islam can be given only by Muslims, not by non-Muslims. That too, a Muslim who is practicing Islam for the last 5 years is alone eligible. But you don't see such restrictions under Hindu religious and charitable institutions. Even non-Hindus can give donations for charitable Hindu religious institutions. So this is one reform. The next one, Wakf by user. This is one category of Wakf. So if a movable or removable property used for religious and charitable purposes without any documents, then that is called Wakf by user. So the Amendment Act of 2025 has omitted Wakf by user. So all the existing Wakfs by user, that is through practice, they will be allowed to continue. But in future, Wakf by user are not allowed. Even when it comes to the existing Wakf by user, if it relates to government property, then there the government can intervene to do inquiry and get back that property. So if here, if a person before donating his movable or immovable property for a religious or charitable purposes must provide for the maintenance of the Muslim women, orphan children, divorced women. So after providing for their maintenance, then only later on the property can be given as Wakf. So this provision was made in the Amendment Act of 2025. So Wakf can be given only after fulfilling the needs of the Muslim women, whether divorced, and also the orphan children. That is one safeguard, one reform. Then, to ensure transparency in the management of Wakf property, Mutawali is one who looks after the Wakf property. They are expected to register property details on the central portal within 6 months to enhance accountability. See, many a times we have seen in the recent past and also in the distant past that even the government property was declared as Wakf by the state Wakf boards. So if there is any government property in dispute as Wakf, then to investigate that matter, there will be an officer of the rank of Joint Secretary and above. See, an officer above the rank of collector will investigate government properties claimed as Wakf, preventing unwarranted claims. Then, earlier in the Wakf tribunal to decide the disputes relating to the Wakf property, we had earlier Wakf tribunal. But